Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
New York certainly has been a busy town today, as this morning near Trump Tower, there were a lot of protesters and a lot of media present as Donald Trump gave his day after press conference. After being found guilty on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records, he had much to say, including flexing his ability to fundraise off of this verdict. Here he was earlier this morning.
Last night, we just got a report this morning, in the history of politics, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, somebody will find that I'm wrong, maybe, but I don't think so. They raised with small money donors, meaning like $21, $42, $53, $38, a record $39 million in about a 10-hour period.
Raising tens of millions of dollars off the conviction. By the way, the official number we got earlier was 34.8. Maybe they're making more, according to the president, though, as he says, maybe someone will tell him that he's wrong. But it was a meandering speech. It was billed as a news conference, a press conference. Kailey, not one question was taken from a reporter, and there was laughter in the crowd when he called Joe Biden the dumbest president in American history. So it's difficult to tell what the media contingent was compared to supporters who were in the room there. But we have a lot of questions about what's next for Donald Trump. He just got through the throes here of the verdict. He's speaking to the American people today. Now what? The answer, by the way, will include a meeting with a probation officer. And we want to bring in Jim Zirin, the former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, who's been awfully helpful with us through each stage of this trial. Is that the case, Jim? Will that be the next phase here for Donald Trump as his legal team cooks up an appeal?
Well, I think the next phase, you're absolutely right, is going to be an investigation by the probation department of the court. There'll be a report to the judge, and then the judge first is going to entertain motions to dismiss the case, which pro forma motions, and will undoubtedly be denied. The judge will impose sentence, and following the imposition of sentence, which I think is July 11th, the appellate process can begin.
Okay, so Jim, while that process is happening, can I just get a point of clarification? While all of that is underway, is Donald Trump still under the gag order? Because he seemed to suggest so during his news conference earlier today, yet also appeared to say a bunch of disparaging things about Michael Cohen, which theoretically could be in violation of the gag order. So where exactly does that stand here?
The gag order is still in place. He must not disparage the witnesses, court personnel, or the jurors. I think if he goes after the jurors, there'll be another citation for contempt in addition to the 20 or so citations that he now has. The judge seemed to be lenient with regard to disparagement of Michael Cohen. Where Cohen had attacked him, he had some sort of right of retort. So although he didn't identify Cohen by name, it was obvious he was talking about Cohen, called him a sleazebag, and he undoubtedly was advised or felt that he had a certain latitude in attacking Cohen, who's been on television attacking him.
Jim, we heard a lot about the trial itself from Donald Trump earlier. Said it was very unfair. When the government wanted something, they got everything they wanted. We wanted a venue change. We didn't get it. I paid a lawyer, totally legal. He says it's a legal expense, not sheetrock. It's not construction. It's a legal expense. What would you say back to Donald Trump after what just transpired in court the last 7 weeks?
Well, tell me what legal services Cohen rendered. The jury believed Cohen. We have to accept that. And the expense was incurred to cloak in secrecy the payment to the porn star, Stormy Daniels, to cover up the tryst. No legal services were involved. This was arranged by Michael Cohen, and he was the fixer, the arranger, the enforcer for Donald Trump. And in fact, he went to jail over this very transaction because he was indicted for it in the federal court.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, the fact that he was indicted and many other things came to light over the course of the trial, or certainly were made note of repeatedly. To go back to something else Joe was just talking about, though, in terms of what Donald Trump said this morning about what he perceived to be unfairness with the way all of this played out, he had a few specific assertions about what wasn't allowed to happen in the courtroom, what testimony could not be heard from certain witnesses that he wanted. Is any of that going to have merit in the appeal process?
I don't think so. And whatever he asserts in the appeal process, he'll have to back up with facts, which he hasn't done in this 33-minute rant you just heard at Trump Tower. It is not true that his witnesses were not permitted to testify. He wanted to call a campaign finance expert, and the judge allowed it, but narrowed the scope of what he was going to be allowed to testify about. And that's standard practice. The law had to come from the judge. It doesn't come from an expert. Otherwise, you'd have a battle of experts, and that would preempt what the jury is supposed to do.
Donald Trump also talked, Jim, about his decision, or at least what we thought was his decision to not testify. He said, "I would have testified." This is a quote. "I wanted to testify. The theory is, though, you never testify, but I would have loved to." What would have happened if he chose to testify in his own defense?
I think if he had taken the stand, number one, he would have been cross-examined on the substance of the transaction and his role in the transaction. And there, he would have had to admit his role, which was a contested issue in the case, or he would have been faced with further charges of perjury. Secondly, the judge did allow limited cross-examination. He made that in response to a motion that is always made at the beginning of the trial. And he said there were certain areas that the prosecutor could go into if Trump took the stand, and certain which had bearing on credibility. And there were other areas he was not going to allow the prosecutor to go into. So there's this so-called biased judge making rulings in favor of Trump.
Well, and certainly the biased judge or the corrupt judge, to use whatever language that Donald Trump has been using to describe Juan Merchan, as well as the idea that this was, as he repeatedly has said, a Soros-funded district attorney in Alvin Bragg, the idea that all of this was brought upon him for political reasons. I feel like it's worth just making it clear, though, Jim, even if that were true, if these charges should never have been brought, as Trump and many other Republicans have said, the fact that a jury found enough merit in the evidence to convict him in all 34 counts, should that then therefore essentially make moot that entire point? Because even if you question the motive of these charges being brought, ultimately 12 everyday Americans that the defense agreed could serve as adequate jurors decided Trump was guilty of these crimes.
Well, in the first place, the charges were brought by a grand jury in New York County. We don't know how many of those grand jurors, I suppose there were 23 of them, were Republicans. We don't know how many of them liked Trump. We just don't know what their biases and prejudices were. They have said again and again and perpetuated the lie that Bragg ran for office on a platform of getting Donald Trump. That's not true. In fact, he avoided discussing the Trump case when he was running in the primaries, and he got the Democratic nomination, and which is tantamount to election. So you cannot say that Bragg brought these charges because he was a biased prosecutor determined to get Trump, or he was fulfilling a campaign promise. Letitia James, the Attorney General, did run for office on a promise she was going to get Trump, but that's a different question. Bragg, I think, showed tremendous courage here. He's been a great district attorney. Crime is down, contrary to what Trump says. And Bragg was very reluctant to bring these charges until they were totally vetted and investigated. In fact, the fraud charges which were the subject of a civil case that Letitia James brought against Trump, were not brought by Alvin Bragg. He declined on those charges. He went with these charges because he believed that this would lead to a successful prosecution. He was vilified. He was called a racist. He was attacked, and he went ahead. He's really a profile in courage. And the case went to before a judge in a court of law, and it was presented to a jury, and the jury unanimously convicted. And Bragg is completely vindicated.
Well, lastly, Jim, you know it's our job to ask you what you think is going to happen at sentencing. Is Donald Trump, are we to believe, going to be slicing garlic at Rikers Island?
I think it's entirely possible because in sentencing, the judge takes into account a number of factors. There is the factor of Trump's age. He's 77 years old. That's in his favor, unlikely to sentence a 77-year-old man to jail. Trump, even in his press conference, spoke about his age, and then really realizing that he used that weapon against Joe Biden, he sort of pulled away from it. There's the point that Trump has never been convicted of anything. Well, he's never been convicted of anything because he's managed to delay the three other trials that would be had against him in the federal, two in the federal court and one in Illinois. What would be against him is the panoply of civil cases where he's been found liable, including the E. Jean Carroll case, where he was adjudicated a sexual abuser, where he defamed a woman without any basis whatsoever, and the civil fraud case, where a judgment was entered against him for $500 million. So those are factors which would militate in favor of a jail sentence, plus the fact that Trump is a public figure, and he's a public figure who engaged in a corrupt and illegal act in order to win the 2016 election. And when a public figure engages in conduct like that, judges like to make an example of them, because it will deter such conduct in the future, either on his part or the part of other people who are seeking public office.
All right, Jim Zirin, it's always great to get your perspective. You've been with us through the very beginning, and it's great to have you back now that this has reached a conclusion, although the appeals process still needs to play out. Jim Zirin, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, we appreciate your time. And now we want to consider the political ramifications here and bring in our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, as we said at the top of the show, Donald Trump so far has raised more than $30 million in the aftermath of this verdict. Is he winning this right now?
Well, I think he's taking advantage of it. I'd say that. This is a long haul campaign. It only matters what happens in November. And so if he takes in, $35 million, but he scares away a few 100,000 potential voters for himself, which he needs to be able to compete in these states, it'll be a bad trade. All the money in the world can't buy you votes. And so the reality is we don't know what net effect this will have on the voters, but we have seen things like this week's Marist poll, which indicates 17% of his vote would be considered up for grabs potentially if he has a conviction. Now, we know he has a conviction, so we'll start to see polling data come in based on that that'll tell us whether or not this is going to hurt him at the ballot box.
Jeanne, we heard Donald Trump talk about Joe Biden today. Said he was the dumbest president we ever had. There was laughter in the crowd. Called him a Manchurian candidate. What does Joe Biden do now?
He's got to keep reminding people that this is a convicted felon. He's got to keep reminding people that nobody's above the law, even a former president, that he was convicted by a jury of his peers. And he's got to use his bully pulpit to explain to people what Donald Trump was found guilty of. So he's got some work to do, but most importantly, he's got to do the work of the American public as it pertains to the economy, immigration, the border, foreign policy. And to his credit, that's what he's been doing while Donald Trump has been in Manhattan fighting off these charges as a convicted felon. So I think he can do it, but he has to make sure he focuses on the issues of concern to the people, all the while explaining what their choice is between him, age and all, and a convicted felon.
Yeah. Our great panel with us today, this day after the verdict, Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis will have much more time to take a deeper dive with our signature panel coming up. With Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Breaking news, shocking to many people last evening. 34 guilty counts. Donald Trump speaking about them earlier today from Trump Tower. A press conference, as it was billed, did not include a single question from a reporter in Trump Tower. Certainly not Gregory Korte, who's with us today at the table here in Washington. Bloomberg White House and politics reporter with his eyes on the campaign trail. Great to see you, Gregory. We were talking shortly after this all transpired last night, and I'd love your take, since you've been so steeped in the research here, on what polls we're talking about. I know that we did have numbers going back to January at Bloomberg that asked independents, swing state voters, what they would think about a conviction, what they would think about incarceration. But there's been a lot of noise around this. Do we have any sense of what impact this will have?
Yeah, so here are the numbers if you look at the polls. And I'm going to talk about our Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll of swing state voters because, A, the swing state voters are the most important to talk about here, but also it's a poll, obviously, that I know the best. But these are numbers that are reflected in other polls that are out there, give or take. So 53% of swing state voters said they would be somewhat or very less likely to vote for Trump if he were convicted, and even less likely if he were sentenced on that crime. Now, that 53%, many of them weren't going to vote for him to begin with, right? So it's really the 17% is the number that I'm focused on. 17% of people who said they were going to vote for Trump said, I would reconsider if I had that new information. 17%, interesting number. That's about the amount of support that Nikki Haley gets within the Republican Party. So if you want to think about these as those Nikki Haley, more traditional Republicans, that's probably not a bad comparison to make. And of those 17%, 8% said they would be very less likely to vote for Trump if he were convicted. Okay. So those are considerable numbers given how close all of these races are in these swing states.
Be the difference maker.
Now I'm going to argue against our own poll here. And the reason is if you ask a hypothetical question, you get a hypothetical answer, right? So these may well be voters who say, look, I wouldn't vote for him if he was convicted, but I don't think he's going to get convicted. That's now a counterfactual, right? He has been convicted. We know what has happened. Right. And so it's going to be very important and interesting to see over the next few days, and I would expect we would get some more data by Sunday from a number of different high-quality polls that could give us a little bit more input on this. Former President Trump himself at his so-called news conference, you don't get to call it a news conference if you don't answer questions. But he cited this Daily News poll that has him continuing up. That's a flash overnight poll. Wouldn't put too much stock in it.
No.
But look, this is certainly going to energize his base. It has turbocharged his fundraising.
Yeah, God knows.
$34 million in less than a day is more than he usually gets in 2 or 3 weeks.
Yes, yeah.
And if he can continue to gin up his supporters on this issue, he's certainly going to energize his voters to show up and to support him with a check or two.
$1 million for each count is quite amazing how that works out. So you just said a couple of interesting things, because this could be any number of trials we were asking people about back in January, right? We could still have, by the way, a January 6th Jack Smith trial. Do we know how these various indictments stack up in voters' minds?
That's very interesting, because we asked the numbers that I just gave you were from our January poll, and we had that same follow-up question is, okay, do one of these cases matter more than others? So in our February poll, we asked on each one of these 4 criminal cases individually. And what we found was it really doesn't matter. Voters aren't really differentiating between this Alvin Bragg case in Manhattan about falsified business documents as opposed to the Jack Smith cases about election, what happened on January 6th, or efforts to overturn the election, or the Mar-a-Lago case in Florida that has to do with classified documents. Voters pretty much put those all into the same bag.
What did you make of the speech, by the way? He started on the border. This is supposed to be, again, a news conference on this first ever criminal conviction of a former president. Start on the border. They're ruining our country. They don't want you to have cars, he said. Then he got into the case a little bit, talked about some of the stuff that we've heard before. It was rigged. It was Joe Biden, even though it's a state court. Was there anything new here? Are you surprised he showed up with kind of the same retribution speech?
Yeah, if you missed it and you're wondering whether he said anything you haven't heard before, the answer is probably no. Yeah. This was, as you say, a little bit in between these daily statements that he's given outside of court for the past 5-6 weeks and a rally. I liked what our colleague David Gura, how he put it from outside the courthouse or outside Trump Tower earlier this morning. It was kind of a supercut of Trump grievances over the trial, interspersed with all of his usual campaign pronouncements about immigration and the state of the country.
He called Joe Biden the dumbest president we've ever had. He got some laughter in the crowd, which also made me wonder how many reporters were there versus supporters. He got into January 6th, whether he called the National Guard. I mean, this really was, we were all over the place on this. But he talked about whether he would have testified. He said, I wanted to testify. The theory is you never testify, but I would have loved to have testified. He, of course, never stood a chance of testifying in this trial, right?
He has the constitutional right to testify. He also has the constitutional right under the Fifth Amendment not to testify and not have that held against him. He chose not to testify. Look, and can you have it both ways in the court of public opinion? That's the argument he's going to make. I think what he said was, if he had said it's a beautiful day and it's raining outside, he might have been indicted for, and then he sort of trailed off to talk about the actual weather outside. So look, it's Trump. You kind of expect that from him, and the jury made the decision based on the evidence they had without his testimony.
Sometimes you say things enough times, and people start to believe it or consider it to be fact or canon. And he keeps talking about this weaponization of government and that this is Joe Biden's case. He said, quote, I'm the leading person for president. I'm under a gag order by a man that can't put 2 sentences together, given by a court, and they are in total conjunction with the White House and the DOJ, unquote. Do we have any reason to believe that? We don't. And, a couple of weeks ago, Trump came out of the courtroom and made that exact same point, but then he added a qualification to it. He said, I can't prove that, but I think it's true. Right. So, again, this is one of those arguments that the former president's going to make. Look, Alvin Bragg is also a Democrat. In this super partisan, polarized country that we live in now, it's hard to dismiss the political aspect to all of this. Mm-hmm. It's an open question. If the same behavior had happened in a Republican jurisdiction, would the former president have been indicted? I don't know. I can only speculate that it would be less likely to happen that way, right? So, does he have a point? Look, that's up to each individual voter to decide, and people are going to bring their own partisan frames to that question. We mentioned this $34.8 million number, small dollar online contributions. The whales are lining up too, though. The mega donors are not spooked by this. Yeah, and it's interesting. Even before the verdict yesterday, we started to see some of the Wall Street titans, people like Bill Ackman, leaning towards supporting the former president here. They have been somewhat on the sidelines. Bill Ackman's a very interesting guy because he's been looking for any alternative to a Trump-Biden rematch, right? Right. He supported Dean Phillips. Made that clear. He's been curious about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And now seems to be maybe landing back towards President Trump. This has been an agonizing election cycle for Wall Street to try to figure out who is in their best interest. They like
Trump policies. They like the idea of tax cuts. They like his views on regulation. They're not always so sure about his respect for the rule of law, which is very important in markets.
I'm surprised why we didn't hear about any issues today. Couldn't Donald Trump have gone in there and said, hey, we're going to fight this. I've got the entire Republican Party. America's at my back. We're going to make the tax cuts permanent. We're going to start going through a checklist of things that I can do if you just elect me one more time.
And in this case, I think, very often Donald Trump is his own worst enemy, right? On the messaging, he is so aggrieved by what is happening to him in the courtroom that it has distracted him. And look, he has been in a courtroom. He's been stuck there. This is the hand that he's dealt.
That's right.
But yes, as of now, we have not seen a pivot back to the campaign. And look, the sentencing is going to be July 11th. That's 4 days before the start of the Republican National Convention.
Can't imagine.
You have to think that all of these legal issues are going to continue to color Trump's rhetoric up until the convention and through the convention.
We're going to be in a convention hall where he's doing a jailhouse call on the big screen. Is this?
That's going to be up to one person, and that's Judge Marchand.
Unbelievable. Yeah. I'm really glad you could come by today. Gregory Korte with us from the campaign trail to Washington and right here to the table at Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
President Biden not answering questions shouted at him by reporters about Donald Trump's conviction yesterday, although he did, in those remarks from the state dining room at the White House, address what happened yesterday, saying that it shows the American principle that no one is above the law, that was reaffirmed. He noted that it was a state case, not a federal case, heard by a jury of 12 citizens. And he said that's how the American system of justice works, going on to say it would be reckless and dangerous and irresponsible for anyone to say that this was rigged just because they don't like the verdict. But of course, it was then followed by pretty remarkable remarks on the Middle East. The president, Joe, announcing an Israeli offer, a comprehensive new proposal, to use his words, and a roadmap to an enduring ceasefire and release of all hostages that has been transmitted through Qatar to Hamas. 3 phases here. The first is a temporary ceasefire that would last 6 weeks. Phase 2 would be a permanent end to hostilities. And the president said if negotiations for that second phase take longer than 6 weeks, the ceasefire will continue until phase 2 is allowed to begin.
Yeah, this was an important moment here, Kailey. 3 phases that would include the exchange of all remaining living hostages, hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. We want to assemble our panel to get their take on this. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors, on a day we thought we'd be talking about Donald Trump's legal future. And in part, we are with the remarks here. I'm going to start there with you both. Going into this news conference, we were asking you, or this set of remarks by the president, if you thought he would or should address the case in New York. Jeanne, that is exactly where he began. Time well spent?
It absolutely was. And his tone was absolutely right. As Kailey just went through, he talked about the fact that he was judged by a jury of his peers at the state level, that this is the reality in the United States, that nobody is above the law. And the fact is, Donald Trump can appeal this decision. But I think one of the most important things I heard was when he said it is irresponsible for anybody to be talking about this decision as rigged and to try to delegitimize our judiciary. And that is something we've heard not just from Donald Trump, but from the other leaders of the Republican Party, right up to the highest elected official, Mike Johnson, to Governor Reynolds, to Lindsey Graham, to Marco Rubio. I mean, the list goes on and on. It is irresponsible. And when, the former governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, came out yesterday, and he said that the reality is that we should respect the decision. He was warned by the Trump campaign that his election bid for the Senate is over. So the president was right on that, and his remarks were on point.
Rick, we'll get to what he said actually about the proposal that Israel has put on the table here. But first, do you agree with Jeanne's characterization? Did he strike the right tone here?
Yeah, it certainly created a pretty stark contrast to what Donald Trump did at the Trump Tower today with, this rambling 1-hour diatribe about grievances. So makes a good contrast, and I think did the basic minimum that he could do. I would hope that Democrats would fan out now and really go on the offensive, because we've seen this act before. After Bill Clinton and the Starr report, he went in and really defined it, and Republicans got on defense. And so this is exactly the opposite from a partisan nature. But I think the Biden folks are going to have to go out and do more than he did today.
Let's talk about this proposal. We should make clear this has not been accepted. What we just heard has been transmitted, as the president told us, by Qatar to Hamas. But, Jeanne, there are progressive Democrats who have been waiting for some news here, and a Biden White House and campaign looking for a breakthrough. We just heard the details, again, summarized by Kailey: a complete ceasefire, withdrawal of Israeli forces, release of hostages, living hostages, and hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. Does this sound like a breakthrough moment to you?
I hope it is. It is really hard to tell. While the president was talking, I was thinking about the fact that the Middle East, going all the way back to Richard Nixon, if not before, has been really a stumbling block for American presidents, left, right, and center, Republican and Democrat, from Richard Nixon all the way through. And so, this is very tough. The president said that. We all want to see a breakthrough. I think his tone is right, but I think it is very, very early to declare something a breakthrough. It's very hard to trust Hamas. It's very hard to know what they will do. We're talking about a 6-week temporary ceasefire in phase 1 and a permanent ceasefire in phase 2. That would be an amazing step forward, but hard to say we're there at this point. But I give the president and his team, including the CIA director and the Secretary of State, a lot of credit for working on this, and Qatar for working at it as it has in terms of being a middleman or state, if you will, to try to make progress on this. It is so much needed. And the remarks about the hostages, I think that's where all of our minds should be. They have been suffering there for far too long.
Well, Rick, the president essentially said that this deal is on the table, that Hamas says it wants a ceasefire, and he says this deal is an opportunity to prove whether they really mean it, seemingly addressing those words at Hamas. Also, though, seeming to speak to a domestic audience. He said everyone who wants peace now must raise their voices, suggesting they need to be pressuring Hamas to accept the terms of this agreement. Does this help him domestically with those people at home who have been pleading for peace now?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty smooth move on the president's part. I mean, this is a Israeli offer, looks really generous and reasonable. And I would say most people don't think of the Israeli position on this as being generous or reasonable lately. And he's putting it all on Hamas now. And I thought what was really interesting about his comments is he said that Israel has accomplished its goal, which was to devastate Hamas and basically take them out as a entity. And that's the first I've heard of that being determined. Israel, I don't think, has actually articulated that themselves. So all this becomes available now that Hamas has been devastated. And now all this is on the desk of the Hamas leadership. And I think it was pretty interesting negotiating strategy for the president to go out and use the bully pulpit in the United States to put all the heat now on Hamas. If this fails, it's Hamas only. Anybody who wants to criticize Joe Biden, all he can say is, hey, we put this deal on that would end the hostilities for good, and Hamas didn't take it. It's all on Hamas. So I like it. I think it's an appropriate way to use the presidency. And, now we look like we're part of the campaign to get Hamas to do the right thing. Hopefully it works out, because it's better for everybody if it does.
Remarkable timing this day after the Trump verdict. And thanks to our great panel for staying overtime to help us understand what we just heard, the implications here at home and globally. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg's signature political panel here. We'll have more with Rick and Jeanne in the late edition of Balance of Power that starts at 5 p.m. Washington time, as we add the voice, pick the brain of Nick Wadhams, who runs our national security team here in Washington. A breaker that not everyone saw coming today. This is a late ad on the president's schedule. What do you make of the timing and what we just heard?
Well, obviously the timing is pretty interesting. I think you're seeing a president who wants to put the focus very much back on policy, and it's also an element of deflection a little bit. He wants to put the pressure on Hamas. He also wants to make a clear show to folks back home, both Republicans and Democrats, progressives, kids on college campuses who have been protesting all through the spring. He is in the thick of this. He is pressing for a solution and essentially saying, listen, this is our best chance right now.
Well, best chance doesn't necessarily mean a guaranteed outcome.
Right.
Israel has made a proposal. In the past, Israel has not accepted proposals Hamas has made. So if this is now in the hands of Hamas, how likely is it that they're going to readily agree to this?
Well, that is the question. But the other question I also have is, how genuine is this proposal? I mean, it was only a couple days ago that Israel said we're going to need at least another 7 months to keep going after Hamas. So what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made clear is they do not want a situation where Hamas remains in operation. So how can you do a ceasefire with an entity that you say you are determined not to let exist? And Israel so far has just not answered that question.
Palestinian civilians would return to their homes, he says, including in the north, under Phase 1. This, I presume, would resonate in Gaza. What would be the impact for Joe Biden's image on that side?
Well, I mean, I think what you're seeing here is a president who is trying to walk a very fine line between the pressure from those who support Israel, which is a significant portion of the Democratic Party and also among Republicans, but the very vocal wing, increasingly vocal wing of the Democratic Party that believe he needs to do a lot more to help Gazans. So when he's saying things like that, people will be allowed to return home, he is making an explicit plea and sending an explicit message to those progressives who really feel that he has not done enough to support the people of Gaza.
And this is all coming directly from President Biden himself. What should we make of, Nick, that this was announced not by Israel, not by Qatar or Egypt, who have served as mediators? Hamas didn't say it had received this proposal. President Biden is where we heard this from.
Well, I mean, I think what we've had a lot happening in the shadows. The broad outlines of this proposal were not a huge surprise. We had known about this idea of a phased approach. Some of the specifics were new, specifically on the number of humanitarian trucks with humanitarian aid that would go in, some of the details of the release. But all of that, I mean, is essentially, he acknowledged, is still stuff that needs to be worked out. But I think what you're seeing is a president who has had a CIA director over in the region, of quietly pushing for, trying to get these talks going and trying to just inject more momentum to say, listen, amid everything that's going on, Israeli troops in Rafah, the campaign continues. We have a possibility for a pause in the fighting. And he's really sending that message to both sides to show that he's right in the thick of this.
Does a ceasefire, if this is accepted, a complete ceasefire, permanent ceasefire, keep the ICC from pursuing the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, I mean, it would certainly help defuse some of the tension there. But, the ICC prosecutor is making his case based on evidence that they have accumulated in the past.
Already committed.
That's been already committed. I mean, he is coming under a lot of pressure right now. I mean, they are seeking those warrants. The arrest warrants have not been issued. That is a huge focus for the U.S. and Israel. But certainly, if there is a ceasefire, it gives them another case to make.
Yeah.
All right, Nick Wadhams, who leads our U.S. national security team here at Bloomberg, thank you for running into the studio for us after we had this 3-phase plan outlined by President Biden. The onus is now on Hamas to accept it. And, of course, this comes the day after Donald Trump was convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. A lot of news here in Washington.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.